Does God's foreknowledge mean we don't have any free will? If God knows what I'm going to do, then since God is never wrong, there's pretty much a 0% chance I'm going to do anything else. And does that mean that I don't have any free will? I never had any ability to do anything else. It might seem that way, but as I explained in a former video in this particular playlist, it's not that way. But let's look at what Augustine says about this. And then hopefully in the next video we'll get to Boethius, and after that maybe Thomas Aquinas. This is Augustine's On Free Choice of the Will, De Libero Arbitrio. We're using the Thomas Williams translation here, published by Hackett. We're in Book 3, and Augustine is the author of this book, but he also appears in this book as a character. This is a thing in some philosophical writings. Augustine is a character in a dialogue, a conversation. This is a philosophical dialogue, and one of the characters is Augustine himself. He's talking to his friend/student Evodius. And here in Book 3, Evodius says, I must admit that I can't quite see how God's foreknowledge of our sins can be consistent with our free choice in sinning. For we must admit that God is just and that he has foreknowledge, but I would like to know how it can be just to punish sins that happen necessarily, or how things that God foreknows do not happen necessarily, or how whatever happens necessarily in creation should not be attributed to the Creator. Don't we attribute to God whatever happens necessarily? And isn't it necessary that what God foreknows will happen? Therefore, isn't it necessary that we do what we do, and therefore don't we have no free will? Augustine replies, why do you think that our free choice is inconsistent with God's foreknowledge? Because it's foreknowledge, or because it's God's foreknowledge? Evodius, because it's God's foreknowledge. Augustine, if you knew that someone was going to sin, he wouldn't sin necessarily, would he? Evodius, indeed he would. Unless I foreknew something with certainty, it wouldn't be foreknowledge at all. Augustine, then it's not God's foreknowledge that makes this sin necessary, but any foreknowledge, since if something is not foreknown with certainty, it is not foreknown at all. Evodius, I agree, but where are you headed with this? So first the question, and then the first lesson. First to the question, and then the first lesson. The question is, if God knows in advance what I'm going to do, if God has foreknowledge, then doesn't that mean that what I do is necessary and therefore that I don't have free will? And the first lesson is, it's not the fact that it's God's foreknowledge that supposedly causes this problem. It's just the fact that it's foreknowledge. If you foreknow something, if you know anything at all, then it's true, because that's what knowledge means. Or in this formulation, knowledge involves certainty, and therefore there can be no chance of what you know not being true. So it's not the fact that it's God that matters, it's the fact that it's foreknowledge. Well, what does Augustine say next? He says, unless I am mistaken, you do not force someone to sin just because you foreknow that he is going to sin. Nor does your foreknowledge force him to sin, even if he is undoubtedly going to sin, since otherwise you would not have genuine foreknowledge. So if your foreknowledge is consistent with his freedom in sinning, so that you foreknow what someone else is going to do by his own will, then God forces no one to sin, even though he foresees those who are going to sin by their own will. Why then can't our just God punish those things that his foreknowledge does not force to happen? Just as your memory... Hang on, that was a rhetorical question. The answer is God can. Let's ask the question again. Why then can't our just God punish those things that his foreknowledge does not force to happen? Just as your memory does not force the past to have happened, God's foreknowledge does not force the future to happen. Note the interest here in God's justice. We're interested in whether sinners can rightfully be condemned for sinning. We're interested in whether God can rightly, justly punish people for sinning if he foreknew they were going to sin. And for God's punishment of sin to be just, it would seem that they have to sin freely. And how can they sin freely if God foreknows what they're going to do? And the answer is simple, that it's not God's foreknowledge that supposedly causes the problem, it's just knowledge that supposedly causes the problem. And then the second lesson is, knowledge doesn't make anyone sin. Knowledge doesn't create a fact. Knowledge is of a fact. That knowledge of a thing is correct is because the thing is true, not vice versa. If your foreknowledge is consistent with someone's freedom in sinning, so you can have foreknowledge of someone's free choice. It's a thing. It happens. You can know in advance what someone is going to do. And That doesn't mean you're controlling what he's going to do. It just means you happen to know. That's what knowledge means. Just as your memory does not force the past to have happened, God's foreknowledge does not force the future to happen. So, observe, when I know what I've freely chosen in the past, my knowledge does not remove my freedom. What I freely chose to do is the reason I have that memory, not vice versa. And why should it be any different when we're looking forward in time? The only difference is it's usually harder to know the future than it is to know the past, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. Even we humans can do it sometimes, and of course God can do it better. And so there's no reason to worry at all about foreknowledge and free will. And now that I've said all that, let's rewind just a bit. This was me jumping into the conversation in this edition published by Hackett, page 77. But this particular talk about foreknowledge actually begins on page 73, where Evodius mentions the issue of foreknowledge. Since these things are true, I very much wonder how God can have foreknowledge of everything in the future, and yet we do not sin by necessity, etc., etc. And I'm not going to go over the whole conversation that leads there, but I will point out just a little bit about it. And I think I'll just point out maybe two things about this one paragraph, page 73. Augustine says to Evodius, "You have knocked powerfully on the door of God's mercy. May it be present and open the door to those who knock." So, in other words, you should seek the answer to questions like this piously. You should pray. You should ask God for wisdom when you are seeking for wisdom. And Augustine continues, "Nevertheless, I think the only reason that most people are tormented by this question is that they do not ask it piously. They're more eager to excuse than to confess their sins." So some people ask this question in an attempt to excuse themselves. God knew what I was going to do, so it's his fault. Well, no, it's not. But the first thing is not actually to get the answer. The first thing is to ask the question properly, not in an attempt to excuse your own sin, but in a prayerful attempt to gain wisdom. That's the right way to handle this question. Next video, hopefully, we'll talk about what Boethius says about this question. Thanks for watching.